My name is Nathan Phillips, and I guess I should tell you about what happened in Redwood National Park last fall. The kind of thing that changes your life forever, that makes you question everything you thought you knew. I was a detective with the Oakland PD, and this case started like any other missing persons report. It was supposed to be a simple weekend with my 15-year-old daughter, Emily. Our relationship had been rocky since the divorce, and I thought combining my investigation with our custody weekend might help us bond. Yeah, I know, not my brightest idea. But when you're a desperate dad trying to connect with your teenage daughter, you don't always think straight. I remember pulling up to the park in my old 1990 Fleetwood Bounder RV. I'd modified it for work, added some police scanners, research equipment, and, don't tell anyone, a hidden weapons cache. Emily sat in the passenger seat, arms crossed, earbuds firmly in place, making it clear she'd rather be anywhere else. "This is so lame, Dad," she said, finally pulling out one earbud. "Why couldn't we just go to the movies like normal people?" I tried explaining about the 6 hikers who'd gone missing over the past few months, but she just rolled her eyes. Teenagers, right? That's when we met Dr. Rebecca Morrison, the Forest Service biologist. She was waiting for us at the ranger station, clutching a folder full of papers and looking worried. The fog was rolling in thick that evening, which wasn't unusual for early fall in Northern California, but something about it felt different. "Detective Phillips?" Dr. Morrison extended her hand. "Thank goodness you're here. We've found something unusual." Emily perked up a bit at that word, unusual. I noticed her removing her other earbud. Dr. Morrison led us to a map spread out on a nearby table, marking spots where hikers had vanished. But what caught my eye were the photos of strange symbols carved into ancient redwoods, symbols that shouldn't have been there. As we talked, an old man appeared from the mist. He moved like a shadow, quiet and watchful. The rangers called him Duke Lucas Henderson, a former park ranger who'd gone hermit years ago. He took one look at Emily, and his face went pale. "You shouldn't have brought her here," he said, his voice rough like gravel. "The mist. It's different this year. They're watching." I laughed it off then. Should have listened. Should have turned that RV around and driven straight back to Oakland. But I didn't. And that's how our nightmare began, right there in the gathering fog of Redwood National Park. That first night in the RV was when things started feeling weird. The fog outside was so thick, I could barely see the trees, even with our bright outdoor lights on. Emily had finally stopped giving me the silent treatment and was sitting at the small dining table, scrolling through her phone. "Dad," she said suddenly, "my phone's acting strange. Look." She held it up, showing me how the screen was flickering with static, even though we still had signal bars. I was about to check it when our police scanner started making this awful screeching noise. Not the usual static or chatter, this was different, like nothing I'd heard before. Emily covered her ears, and I rushed to turn it off. "What was that?" she asked, and for the first time since we arrived, I heard real worry in her voice. "Probably just interference from the mountains," I said, trying to sound confident. But I didn't believe it myself. That's when we heard the knocking. 3 slow taps on the RV's side. My hand automatically went to my hip where I kept my gun. Emily's eyes went wide. "Stay here," I whispered, grabbing my flashlight. The knocking came again, this time from the other side of the RV. I opened the door slowly, shining my light into the fog. The beam just seemed to bounce back, like the mist was too thick to penetrate. "Hello?" I called out. "This is Detective Phillips. Identify yourself." No answer, just the sound of something moving through the trees, something big. I was about to close the door when Emily gasped, "Dad, look at this!" On the RV's window, visible through the condensation, someone or something had drawn symbols. The same weird symbols we'd seen in Dr. Morrison's photos, carved into the ancient trees. But here's the thing that really got me. We'd been in the RV the whole time. Neither of us had heard anyone walk up to draw them. And the symbols, they were drawn from the outside, but they were glowing faintly, like they were made with some kind of phosphorescent material. I quickly locked the door and closed all the blinds. Emily was hugging herself, trying to look brave, but I could see she was scared. To be honest, so was I. "Dad," she said quietly, "maybe Duke was right. Maybe we shouldn't be here." I pulled her into a hug, something she hadn't let me do in months. "It's okay, kiddo. We're safe in here. First thing tomorrow, we'll talk to Dr. Morrison about these symbols." But as we sat there in our locked RV, the fog pressing in around us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. And somewhere in the distance, I swear I could hear something moving through the trees, something way too big to be human. The next morning, the fog was still there, but at least we could see about 20 feet ahead now. Emily and I hadn't slept much. Every little sound from the forest had kept us awake. I made us some quick breakfast, but Emily just picked at her cereal, which wasn't like her at all. "Those symbols are gone," she said, looking out the window. And she was right. The strange glowing marks had completely disappeared, leaving no trace they were ever there. We were about to head to Dr. Morrison's research station when Duke appeared out of nowhere, making us both jump. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept either. "Found something you need to see," he said, his voice shaking a bit. "Up by the old hiking trail." I wasn't sure about taking Emily, but she refused to stay in the RV alone. Can't blame her, really. We followed Duke through the misty forest, our feet crunching on fallen leaves. The trees seemed to go up forever, disappearing into the fog above us. That's when we found it, a campsite, but not like any I'd seen before. 6 tents were set up in a perfect circle, like someone had used a compass to place them. But what made my skin crawl was that all the tents were empty, with sleeping bags still inside. Coffee cups sat by the cold fire pit, some still half full. "Look at this, Dad," Emily called out. She was standing by one of the tents, pointing at the ground. The footprints there made no sense. They started normally, like someone walking. But then, they went straight up the side of a massive redwood tree. 15 feet up. Dr. Morrison arrived while we were examining the prints. She pulled out some kind of measuring device that started beeping like crazy. "The radiation readings here are off the charts," she whispered, her face pale. "But it's not any kind of radiation I've ever seen before." That's when Emily grabbed my arm so tight it hurt. "Dad," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "something's watching us." We all froze. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just that thick, heavy fog swirling around us. And there, between 2 ancient redwoods, I saw it. A shadow, but it was huge, maybe 12 feet tall. It moved like it was made of the mist itself. "Nobody move," Duke whispered. But Emily took a step forward, like she was in some kind of trance. "Emily, no." I reached for her, but she was already speaking not in English, but in some language I'd never heard before. And the shadow, it responded. "The thing is, I'm a detective. I deal in facts, in evidence. But what happened next? Well, that's when everything I thought I knew about the world started to fall apart." The shadow moved closer, and I swear the temperature dropped about 20 degrees. My breath came out in white puffs as I reached for Emily, but she kept talking in that strange language, like she was having a conversation with it. "I can understand them, Dad," she said, her voice sounding distant. "They've been here for thousands of years. They're trying to protect something." Before I could pull her back, the shadow disappeared, just vanished into thin air. But it left something behind. There, on the ground where it had been, was an old leather pouch covered in those same symbols we'd seen on the RV. Dr. Morrison picked it up with shaking hands. Inside was what looked like an ancient stone tablet, covered in markings that seemed to glow faintly, just like the symbols from last night. "This is impossible," she muttered, scanning it with her device. "This tablet, it's giving off the same strange radiation as the footprints." Duke's face had gone white. "I've seen this before," he said quietly. 15 years ago. That's why I quit being a ranger. My partner, he. Duke's voice cracked and he couldn't finish. Suddenly, Emily grabbed her head like she was in pain. "They're trying to show me something," she gasped. "There's a cave, underground. Something's down there. Something they've been guarding. And..." She looked at me with terrified eyes. "They say others are coming to take it. Bad people. They need our help." That's when we heard engines in the distance. Lots of them. Through the fog, we could see bright headlights approaching the park entrance. "Government vehicles," Dr. Morrison said, checking through her binoculars. "But those aren't normal Forest Service trucks." I had to make a quick decision. My daughter was somehow connected to whatever these things were. There were mysterious vehicles approaching, and somewhere in these woods was a cave that might explain everything. "We need to move," I said, taking charge. "Duke, you know these woods better than anyone. Where would this cave be?" But before Duke could answer, we heard something that made us all freeze, a sound like thunder. But it came from underground. The ground under our feet started to tremble. "Dad," Emily whispered, clutching my arm. "They say we're running out of time." We ran back to the RV first. I needed my emergency gear, and we had to move fast. While I grabbed my backpack and flashlights, Dr. Morrison copied the tablet's symbols into her notebook. Duke kept watch outside, nervous about those government vehicles. "The cave entrance is near the old creek bed," Duke said when we were ready. "About 2 miles north, but we need to be careful. The mist gets worse up there." We could hear the vehicles getting closer as we started hiking. Emily stayed between me and Dr. Morrison, while Duke led the way. The fog was so thick now that we had to hold onto each other's jackets to stay together. That's when we heard the helicopters. "Get under the trees," Duke whispered urgently. We pressed ourselves against a huge redwood trunk just as spotlights swept through the fog above us. Emily was shaking, but not from fear. She looked like she was listening to something again. "They're coming," she said softly. "The Guardians. They're going to try to stop those people." But she grabbed my hand tight. "Dad, something bad is about to happen." Right then, the ground shook again, harder this time. A deep rumbling sound came from somewhere ahead of us. Through the fog, we saw something that still gives me nightmares. Those giant shadow figures, dozens of them, moving through the trees. But now we could see them better. They looked almost human, but way too tall, with long arms that nearly touched the ground. "The Mist Walkers," Duke whispered. That's what my partner called them. Suddenly, Emily let go of my hand and started running toward the shadows. "Emily, stop!" I shouted, chasing after her. But she was fast, moving like she knew exactly where she was going. We all ran after her, deeper into the foggy forest. The helicopters were getting louder, and we could hear voices shouting behind us. Then, Emily stopped so suddenly, we almost ran into her. We were at the edge of a creek bed, but it was bone dry, and there, in the rock wall, was an opening that definitely wasn't natural. Strange symbols glowed around its edges, the same ones from the tablet. "We have to go in," Emily said firmly. "They're showing me. This is just the beginning. The real secrets are below." I shined my flashlight into the cave. The beam seemed to disappear into endless darkness. This was it, the point of no return. Either we went in and faced whatever was down there, or we turned back and let those government agents take over. But before we could decide, we heard something that made the choice for us. Dogs barking, getting closer. They were hunting us. We had no choice. We went into the cave. I took the lead with my flashlight, Emily right behind me. Then Dr. Morrison, with Duke watching our backs. The barking was getting closer, echoing off the cave walls. The tunnel went down, way down. The air got colder with each step, and there was this weird humming sound, like when you stand near power lines. "Doctor." Morrison's radiation detector was beeping like crazy. "Dad, look!" Emily pointed to the walls. They were covered in those glowing symbols, but these were different. They looked newer, and they were moving slightly, like they were alive. After about 10 minutes of walking, the narrow tunnel opened into something that shouldn't have been possible, a massive underground room, bigger than a football field. Our flashlights couldn't even reach the ceiling. But we didn't need them much, because everything was glowing with a soft blue light. "Oh my God," Dr. Morrison whispered. In the center of the room was what looked like a city, but not like any city I'd ever seen. The buildings were made of some kind of crystal or metal, all connected by bridges that seemed to float in the air. But that's not what made us all stop breathing for a moment. Standing around the city were the mist walkers, dozens of them. In the blue light, we could finally see them clearly. They were tall, yes, but they weren't monsters. They looked ancient and wise, with long silver hair and eyes that seemed to glow like stars. Emily stepped forward, and none of us tried to stop her this time. One of the tallest mist walkers came toward her. It moved like fog itself, its feet not quite touching the ground. "They've been here since before the Redwoods," Emily said, her voice filled with awe. "This city, it's not just a city, it's a gateway." That's when we heard the explosions from above. The whole cave shook, and dust rained down from the ceiling. The government teams had found the entrance. The tall mist walker reached out and touched Emily's forehead. She gasped, her eyes going wide. "Dad," she said, turning to me with tears in her eyes, "they need our help. Those people up there, they've been hunting the mist walkers for years, trying to find this place. If they get in here, they'll destroy everything and open something that should stay closed forever." Another explosion rocked the cave. Voices echoed down the tunnel. We were running out of time. "What do they want us to do?" I asked, knowing I probably wouldn't like the answer. The tall mist walker raised its hand, and suddenly the whole crystal city lit up even brighter. A sound like deep bells filled the cave. Through Emily, they explained their plan. "They need to close the gateway," Emily translated quickly. "But they can't do it alone. They need human help. Dad, they need someone to stay behind and help guard this place, like Duke's partner did years ago." Duke stepped forward, his face set with determination. "I'll do it. This is why I never left the park. I've been waiting for this moment." More explosions shook the cave. We could hear boots stomping down the tunnel now. Dr. Morrison's device was screaming with readings. "Emily," I said, my heart pounding, "we need to go. Now." But Emily didn't move. "Dad, I have to stay too." "No," I grabbed her arm. "Absolutely not." "You don't understand," she said, tears running down her face. "I can communicate with them. They've been calling me since we got here. This is why they let us find this place. They need both of us, Duke, to guard the forest above, and me to help them here." The Mistwalker placed its huge hand gently on Emily's shoulder. In that moment, I saw something in my daughter's eyes. She wasn't scared anymore. She looked peaceful. Dr. Morrison grabbed my arm. "Nathan, they're almost here!" I had to make the hardest choice of my life in just seconds. My daughter was asking to stay with these ancient beings in a hidden city under the earth. Every part of me wanted to grab her and run. But then Emily hugged me, really hugged me, for the first time in years. "Dad, I'll be okay. I promise, but you have to trust me." The footsteps were getting closer. The mist walkers started moving, forming a circle around the city. Blue light began swirling around Emily and Duke. "Go," Emily said firmly. "Dr. Morrison needs to tell the world what's really happening here. And you need to protect us from up there." With tears in my eyes, I hugged Emily one last time. "I love you, kiddo," I whispered. She smiled, looking braver than I felt. "Sir, voices ahead." The shouts from the tunnel were getting closer. "Now go." Emily pushed me away. Dr. Morrison pulled my arm, and we ran towards a side tunnel the Mistwalkers showed us. Looking back one last time, I saw Emily and Duke standing with the tall beings. Blue light swirled around them like a tornado. We barely made it out through a hidden exit behind some rocks. As soon as we emerged into the foggy forest, a massive rumble shook the ground. The cave entrance behind us collapsed completely. The helicopters were still circling, but the fog had gotten so thick they couldn't see us. We could hear angry shouts from the government teams they'd found the collapsed cave too late. Dr. Morrison and I made it back to my RV just as dawn was breaking. The fog started lifting, but it was different now. If you looked carefully, you could see shapes moving in it, protecting the forest. That was 6 months ago. I quit the police force and bought a small cabin near the park. Every few days, the fog gets extra thick, and I find symbols drawn on my windows. Emily's way of letting me know she's okay. Dr. Morrison still works for the Forest Service, but now she's in charge of a special project to protect the unique environment of Redwood National Park. Duke was declared officially missing, but sometimes hikers talk about a friendly old man who appears in the mist to guide lost people back to the trails. The government teams, they come back sometimes with their machines and sensors, but they never find anything. The fog makes sure of that. As for Emily, well, last week I found a note on my doorstep, written in her handwriting. It said, "Dad, I'm happy here. We're protecting something important. And don't worry, I'm learning so much. Maybe someday I can show you. Love, Emily." I still walk in the park every day, especially when the fog rolls in. Sometimes, if I'm quiet and patient, I see things in the mist, tall shapes moving between the ancient trees. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear my daughters laugh on the wind. You might not believe my story. That's okay. But next time you're in the redwoods and the fog rolls in, pay attention. Look closely at the mist between the trees. And if you see something move, something tall and ancient, just nod respectfully and walk away. Because now you know, they're watching, they're protecting, and thanks to my brave daughter, they're not alone anymore. My name is Vincent Blackriver, and I need to tell you about what happened to my family last autumn in the Boundary Waters. Some nights, I still wake up in cold sweat, remembering everything. But this story needs to be told, if only as a warning to others. I guess I should start from the beginning. I'm 42, and I live with my wife Marjorie and our 16-year-old son Tommy in Minneapolis. We're Ojibwe, but I'll be honest, I hadn't been very connected to my heritage. My grandfather was a medicine man, but after he died when I was young, our family drifted away from the old ways. That all changed 3 months ago when the nightmares started. Every night I'd see my grandfather standing in the misty woods, trying to tell me something. His words were always in Ojibwe, a language I barely remembered, but his face was filled with such fear and urgency that I'd wake up shaking. After the 3rd week of these dreams, I knew I had to do something. That's when I got this crazy idea about buying an RV and taking my family up to my grandfather's old ceremonial grounds in the Boundary Waters. Marjorie thought I was having a midlife crisis. Maybe I was. But something deep inside told me I needed to go. We could make it a family adventure, I told Marjorie one morning over breakfast. Tommy's been so glued to his video games lately. Sometime in nature might do him good. Tommy, who was busy texting under the table, just rolled his eyes. But Marjorie, bless her heart, eventually agreed. She's always been the practical one, the one who needs to see things to believe them. I sometimes wonder if things would have turned out differently if she had said no. I found the RV on a local listing, a 1976 GMC Palm Beach motorhome. The price was surprisingly low, which should have been our first warning sign. But at the time, it just felt like luck. The day we went to look at it, something strange happened. Tommy, who hadn't shown interest in anything lately, suddenly perked up when we approached the RV. He pressed his hand against its side and got this weird look on his face. "Dad," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "someone's crying inside." But when we opened the door, the RV was empty. Just some odd scratches on the inside walls that the seller said were from the previous owner's dog. If only we had known then what those scratches really meant. If only we had noticed how the shadows seemed to move when we weren't looking directly at them. If only. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about our first night on the road, when everything started to go wrong. We left Minneapolis early on a chilly October morning. The trees along the highway were already turning red and orange, and a light fog hung in the air. Everything seemed normal at first. Tommy was in the back playing on his phone. Marjorie was reading her book, and I was driving. Around noon, the first weird thing happened. The RV's radio suddenly turned on by itself, playing what sounded like people chanting in Ojibwe. I tried turning it off, but it wouldn't stop. Marjorie reached over and unplugged it completely, yet the voices continued for another minute before fading away. Probably just picking up some strange signal, Marjorie said, but I could tell by her voice that she was unsure. As we drove further north, Tommy started acting strange. He kept staring at the RV's mirrors, sometimes for hours. "Dad," he said during one of our rest stops, "I keep seeing people in the mirrors. They look hungry." I tried to laugh it off, but then I saw something under one of the seats, an old envelope stuffed with photographs. My hands were shaking as I pulled them out. They were pictures of the previous owners, taken over several months. In the first photo, they looked like a happy family, mom, dad, and 2 teenage kids. But in each following picture, they looked thinner, sicker. In the last photo, their eyes. There was something wrong with their eyes. They were too dark, too empty. That night, we parked at a campground. The temperature dropped so low that we could see our breath inside the RV, even though the heater was on full blast. Tommy couldn't stop eating. He went through all our snacks and was still hungry. I was about to go to sleep when I heard Marjorie gasp. She was looking out the window, and when I followed her gaze, my blood ran cold. In the moonlight, about 50 feet from our RV, stood a deer, but something was terribly wrong with it. It was arranged in an unnatural position, like someone had carefully placed it there, and around it were strange footprints in the dirt. Part human, part something else. That's when I remembered my grandfather's stories about the Wendigo, the ancient spirit that brings endless hunger and cold, the spirit that can possess people, turning them into something, not human anymore. And suddenly, I realized why the RV was so cheap, why those scratches were really on the walls, and why Tommy couldn't stop eating. I knew right then that we'd brought something terrible with us, something that had been waiting in this RV, waiting for a new family to feed on, and now it was too late to turn back. That night, none of us could sleep. The wind outside howled like it was alive, and the RV kept making strange creaking sounds. Around midnight, I heard voices talking about missing hunters on our emergency radio. 3 of them had disappeared in these woods just last week. Tommy's behavior was getting worse. I found him in the small RV kitchen at 3 a.m., eating raw meat from our cooler. His eyes looked different, darker somehow. When I called his name, he didn't respond right away, like he was far away in his mind. "I'm so hungry, Dad," he finally whispered, his chin dripping red. "I can't make it stop." Marjorie wanted to take him to a hospital, but we were stuck. The RV wouldn't start, and our phones showed no signal. It felt like something was keeping us here, trapping us in these woods. That's when strange things started happening more often. The mirrors would fog up with icy patterns, even though it wasn't that cold outside. We'd hear scratching sounds from the RV's roof at night. And sometimes, when I looked at Tommy, I could swear his shadow wasn't shaped like him anymore. While searching for a way to call for help, I found my grandfather's old journal hidden in a compartment under the driver's seat. I don't know how it got there, but the pages were filled with warnings about the Wendigo, a spirit that makes people so hungry they start eating human flesh. The journal said something else too, something that made my heart stop. The last entry, written in my grandfather's shaky handwriting, said, "The Wendigo isn't just in these woods. It's in that RV. I trapped it there, but the seal is breaking. If someone finds this, run. Run before it gets hungry again." But it was too late to run. Looking out the window, I saw more mutilated animals arranged in a circle around our RV. And in the distance, something was moving between the trees. something tall and thin, with antlers that scraped the branches. Marjorie grabbed my arm, her voice shaking. "Vincent, look at Tommy." Our son was standing by the window, his breath making frost patterns on the glass. But his reflection showed something else. Something that wasn't our son anymore. The Wendigo hadn't just found us. It was already inside our family. The next few hours were like a nightmare that wouldn't end. Marjorie and I took turns watching Tommy, who kept trying to walk into the woods. Every time we stopped him, he'd cry and say, "They're calling me, Dad. The hungry ones are calling me." While reading more of my grandfather's journal, I found something important. The Wendigo spirit had possessed many families before us. Each time, it would make them buy this RV, drive to these woods, and then, well, the journal had pictures I wish I could forget. But my grandfather had found a way to fight it. He'd written down an old ritual passed down through generations of our people. It needed 3 things: sacred herbs, which he'd hidden in the RV, a blood moon, which was coming tomorrow night, and a sacrifice. That's when we heard screaming outside. Using our flashlights, we saw a local ranger running through the trees. Something was chasing him, something that moved too fast to see clearly. Before we could help, the ranger disappeared into the darkness. All that was left were his torn jacket and radio. Inside the RV, things got worse. Tommy's skin was becoming gray and stretched looking, like he hadn't eaten in weeks. Marjorie tried to hug him, but the moment she touched him, her eyes went completely black. "So hungry," she said, but it wasn't her voice anymore. "So very hungry." I knew I was losing them both. The Wendigo was taking my family, just like it had taken all the others. But this time would be different. This time, I had my grandfather's journal, and I knew what I had to do. The blood moon was rising. I could hear more creatures gathering in the woods around us. The RV's windows were completely frozen now, and strange symbols appeared in the frost, symbols that seemed to move when you looked at them. Tommy and Marjorie were both changing, becoming something else. But I had one last chance to save them, one last chance to end this curse forever. "I'm sorry," I whispered, grabbing the sacred herbs. "I'm so sorry for what I have to do next." The blood moon turned the sky an eerie red. Inside the RV, I could barely recognize my family anymore. Tommy's fingers had grown longer, like claws, and Marjorie's eyes were completely black now. They both moved in strange ways, like puppets being pulled by invisible strings. My hands were shaking as I started the ritual from my grandfather's journal. I spread the sacred herbs in a circle and started saying the old Ojibwe words. Each word felt like fire in my mouth. "Stop, Dad," Tommy growled, but his voice didn't sound human anymore. "You don't know what you're doing." Suddenly, Marjorie grabbed my arm. Her touch was ice cold. "We're so hungry, Vincent," she whispered. "Just let us hunt. Let us feed." That's when something crashed through the RV's window. It was tall, with skin like old bark and antlers that scraped the ceiling, the Wendigo itself. More of them appeared outside, surrounding our RV. They were the previous owners, still trapped between human and monster. Marjorie looked at me, fighting whatever was inside her. For a moment, I saw my wife again in those black eyes. "Vincent," she said in her normal voice, "save our son, please." Before I could stop her, she ran straight at the Wendigo. "Take me instead," she screamed. The monster grabbed her, but something strange happened. Marjorie started glowing with a bright light. Tommy fell to the floor, crying in pain. The darkness was leaving him, flowing out like black smoke. The Wendigo tried to back away, but Marjorie held onto it tight. "Finish it," she yelled. "The ritual! Now!" With tears running down my face, I said the final words of the ritual. The RV started shaking. Lights flashed everywhere. I heard screaming, human and inhuman, and then everything went quiet. The blood moon disappeared behind the clouds. Tommy was himself again, passed out on the floor but breathing normally. Outside, all the Wendigos were gone. But so was Marjorie. It's been 3 months since that terrible night. Tommy and I moved back to Minneapolis, but things will never be the same. The RV? We left it deep in those woods. According to my grandfather's journal, it's now a prison, holding all those evil spirits inside it. Sometimes I wonder if Marjorie's sacrifice helped seal them in there forever. Tommy's different now. He doesn't play video games anymore. Instead, he spends time learning about our Ojibwe heritage and helping me understand grandfather's journal. The hunger is gone, but he still has nightmares. We both do. Strange things still happen around us. On cold nights, we sometimes see Marjorie, not as a scary ghost, but as a soft, warm light that moves through our house. She's watching over us, protecting us from the dark things that still live in those woods. Last week, I got a call from the police. They found those 3 missing hunters, frozen solid even though it wasn't that cold. I didn't tell them what really happened. Who would believe me? But here's the scariest part. Yesterday, I saw an online ad for a familiar-looking RV. Great deal, must sell quickly, it said. The photos showed our old RV, looking brand new, parked at a different dealer 2 states away. I called the number, but it was disconnected. I check the website every day now, hoping that no other family will buy it, because I know the Wendigos are still in there, waiting, hungry. And sometimes, on very quiet nights, I hear Marjorie's voice in my dreams, warning me. They're getting stronger, Vincent. They're trying to break free again. I don't know what will happen next, but I do know this. If you ever see an old GMC Palm Beach motorhome for sale at a price that seems too good to be true, just walk away. Some deals come with a price too terrible to pay. My name is Marcus Redpath. As I sit here, trying to make sense of what happened in Ravenwood Forest last winter, my hands still shake. I'm writing this down because people need to know the truth, even if no one believes me. I used to be in the military, Special Forces Tracking Unit. Now, at 45, I make my living as a wildlife photographer. Well, I did until that week in northern Michigan changed everything. It started with a phone call from Dr. Delia Hawthorne. She was studying wolf migrations and needed someone with tracking skills and camera expertise. The pay was good, and winter wildlife shots always sell well, so I agreed. "Meet me at Ravenwood Trading Post," she said. "And Marcus, bring your warmest gear. The forecast isn't good." When I pulled up to the trading post in my beat-up pickup, 2 things caught my eye. First was Delia's impressive RV, a modified 1981 Winnebago Brave, with what looked like a custom observation deck. Second was the old man standing next to her, wearing a worn-out trapper's coat that had seen better days. "Marcus, this is Ray McCall," Delia said. "Everyone calls him Trapper. He knows these woods better than anyone." Trapper didn't smile when we shook hands. His grip was ice cold, and something in his eyes made me uneasy. He looked older than his 67 years, with deep wrinkles and a gray beard that couldn't hide a nasty scar on his chin. Inside the trading post, while Delia bought supplies, I noticed something disturbing. A wall covered with missing persons posters. Some were new, crisp paper with color photos. Others had yellowed with age, going back decades. All of them had one thing in common: people who vanished in Ravenwood Forest. "Don't stare at those too long," Trapper said behind me, making me jump. "Bad memories in these woods. Bad things happen when the snow gets deep." I was about to ask what he meant when the radio behind the counter started making weird noises. Static and something else, a sound like howling, but not quite right. The store owner quickly turned it off. "Happens all the time lately," he said, "even when the sky's clear as glass." As we loaded the RV, an old Native American man approached Delia. He spoke quietly, but I caught the words "winter walkers" and "sacred ground." Delia thanked him politely, but I saw worry in her eyes. That evening, as we drove into Ravenwood Forest, heavy snow started falling. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching like dark fingers across the winter sky. I've been in some scary places during my military days, but something about these woods felt different. Wrong. I didn't know it then, but this was just the beginning. The real horror was still waiting for us, deep in those ancient trees, where the howls weren't coming from ordinary wolves, and where some legends turn out to be terrifyingly real. We found a small clearing about 5 miles into the forest to park the RV. The snow was falling harder now, and the wind made strange whistling sounds through the trees. As I helped set up our base camp, I noticed something odd. There were no animal sounds, no birds, no squirrels, nothing. In winter woods, you usually hear something, but here it was just silent. "This is weird," I said to Delia as we unpacked our gear. "I've never seen a forest this quiet." Delia nodded, checking her research equipment. "The local wolf packs should be active this time of year. That's why I'm here. Their behavior has changed completely in the last few months." Inside the RV, I set up my photography equipment in the small darkroom they'd built in the back. Trapper sat at the small kitchen table, staring out the window into the darkness. His hands were shaking slightly as he poured himself coffee. That first night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard something moving outside. Not like a normal animal. This sounded big, and it walked almost like a person. I grabbed my flashlight and looked out the window. What I saw made my blood run cold. In the fresh snow, about 50 feet from the RV, were footprints. But these weren't normal tracks. They were huge, bigger than any bear print I'd ever seen, and they looked almost human-like, but not quite, and they were fresh. "You saw them too, huh?" Trapper's voice made me jump. He stood behind me, his face pale in the moonlight. "Those aren't bear tracks, son. And they're not wolf either." "Then what made them?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Before he could respond, we heard it, a howl that made every hair on my body stand up. It wasn't like any wolf I'd ever heard. It sounded almost human. Then another joined in, and another. Soon the whole forest seemed to be singing in perfect, terrifying harmony. Delia rushed into the main area, her research papers clutched to her chest. "This is impossible," she whispered. "Wolves don't howl like this. They can't harmonize like this." The temperature in the RV suddenly dropped so low I could see my breath. The windows started frosting over, even though the heater was running full blast. Outside, the howls got closer. "We need to cover all the windows," Trapper said urgently. "Now. And whatever happens, whatever you hear, don't open the door until sunrise." As we rushed to cover the windows with the emergency blankets, I caught a glimpse of something moving between the trees. Something tall, something that shouldn't exist. That was our first night in Ravenwood Forest. We didn't know it then, but things were about to get much, much worse. The real horror was still waiting for us, and Trapper knew more than he was telling. Much more. The morning light revealed something that made us all uneasy. The RV was surrounded by those strange footprints, dozens of them. They circled our vehicle, like whatever made them had been pacing around us all night. While making coffee, Delia pulled out an old folder. "Look at this," she said, spreading photos on the table. "These are from a research camp that was here last year. They all disappeared." My hands shook as I looked at the photos. The last one showed massive claw marks on the side of their tent. Next to it was a half-blurred image of something tall standing in the trees. "I need to develop the photos I took last night," I said, heading to my darkroom. As the images appeared in the chemical bath, my heart nearly stopped. In the background of one photo, between the trees, were pairs of eyes, glowing eyes that shouldn't have been there. "Trapper," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady, "I think you need to see this." The old man looked at the photo and sank into a chair. "I knew this would happen," he mumbled. "They're getting bolder." "Who's getting bolder?" Delia demanded. "What aren't you telling us?" Trapper's hands were shaking worse than ever. "They're called dogmen by some folks. The natives have another name for them, winter walkers. They're not normal wolves. Not normal anything." Just then, our radio crackled to life by itself. Through the static, We heard what sounded like words. Not human words, but not animal sounds either. "They're trying to talk to us," Trapper whispered. "They want us to come out." "Why?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Because this is their sacred ground, and—" He rolled up his sleeve, showing us a terrible scar that looked like a bite mark. "Because once they mark you, they never let you go." The temperature started dropping again. Outside, the wind picked up, but the trees weren't moving. That's when we heard them, footsteps in the snow, getting closer to the RV. Heavy footsteps, and they were walking on two legs. Delia's research equipment started going crazy. The needles on all her meters were spinning wildly. "This is impossible," she whispered. "These readings, they're off the charts." I reached for my camera, but Trapper grabbed my arm. "Don't," he warned. "They know when you're watching them, and they don't like it." Something scraped against the side of the RV, something with claws. We all froze, hardly daring to breathe. Then a shadow passed by the covered window, a shadow that stood at least 8 feet tall. We were trapped in our RV, surrounded by creatures that shouldn't exist, with a man who knew more than he was saying. And the sun was starting to set again. The real truth about Trapper, and why he brought us here, was about to come out, and none of us were ready for it. As night fell, Trapper's behavior got stranger. He kept scratching his arms and looking out the windows, even though we had covered them. His eyes seemed different somehow, almost yellow in the RV's dim light. "I have to tell you something," he finally said, his voice shaking. "I didn't just bring you here to help with research. I brought you here because I need help." Before he could finish, a loud bang shook the RV. Something had jumped onto our roof. We could hear claws scraping across the metal above us. Then more bangs. They were surrounding us. "They're here for me," Trapper said, now sweating despite the cold. 50 years ago, I was just a young hunter. I found their burial ground by accident. They bit me. Every full moon since then, I've been fighting it." Delia pulled out her laptop, her hands trembling as she opened some files. "Look at this," she said. "Government reports about secret experiments in these woods during the 1970s. They were trying to create super soldiers using wolf DNA, but something went wrong." "They didn't create us," Trapper growled, and his voice didn't sound human anymore. "They found us. We've always been here." Suddenly, the radio came alive again. This time, we could understand the words, "Brother, come home." I grabbed my military backpack, pulling out an emergency flare gun. "We need to get out of here, now." "No," Trapper said, backing away from us. His face was changing, becoming longer. "It's too late for me. The full moon is rising." Through a gap in the window covering, moonlight spilled into the RV. Where it touched Trapper's skin, thick gray fur began to grow. His hands were turning into claws. "Run," he gasped, fighting against the change. "The burial ground under the big oak. There's a weapon. Ancient can stop them." Delia grabbed her research and I snatched my camera. We had to make a choice: stay in the RV with a transforming Trapper, or face whatever was waiting outside. That's when the RV's door burst open. Standing there was something out of our worst nightmares, a creature 9 feet tall, walking on 2 legs, with the head of a wolf but eyes that looked almost human. Behind it were more shapes in the darkness, their eyes glowing. And Trapper. Trapper was almost one of them now. We had to make a run for the burial ground, but first we had to survive what was about to happen in that RV. I grabbed Delia's hand and pulled her toward the RV's emergency exit at the back. Behind us, Trapper's transformation was complete. He wasn't human anymore. His howl shook the whole RV. "The oak tree," Delia gasped as we ran through the snow. "It has to be that big one we saw earlier." The snow was deep, and the moon cast strange shadows everywhere. We could hear them chasing us, heavy footsteps and breathing that sounded almost like words. The worst part was that some of them were running on 2 legs, just like people. I shot a flare into the sky. The red light showed us something terrifying. We were surrounded, Dogmen were everywhere, moving between the trees. Some were gray, others black, and all of them were huge. Their eyes reflected the flare's light like mirrors. There! Delia pointed at a massive oak tree ahead of us. Its trunk was wider than a car, and strange markings covered its bark. But getting there meant crossing open ground. That's when we heard Trapper's voice, but different, rougher. "You can't stop this, Marcus. The pack needs new blood, just like they needed me 50 years ago." He emerged from the shadows. He still looked a bit like the old man we knew, but also like a wolf standing upright. His clothes were torn, but his eyes were the worst part. They were still human enough to show sadness. "The government didn't make us," he growled. "They tried to control us, study us. But we're older than this country, older than these trees." Suddenly, Delia screamed. One of the creatures had grabbed her arm. Without thinking, I swung my camera bag at its head. The creature let go, but my camera was ruined. We ran for the oak tree. The snow under it was different, darker. Delia fell to her knees and started digging with her hands. I kept shooting flares, trying to keep the pack away. "Marcus," she cried, "I found something." In the snow, her hands had uncovered an old wooden box with tribal carvings. Inside was something wrapped in leather, something that made the creatures back away when we pulled it out. But before we could open it, Trapper jumped between us and the pack. "Run!" he shouted, fighting to sound human. "I'll hold them off. It's the only way I can make things right." We had the weapon, but we still had to survive the night. And the pack's leader, bigger than all the others, was walking toward us on two legs, looking hungry. The next few minutes would decide everything. With shaking hands, Delia unwrapped the leather bundle. Inside was an old bone knife, covered in strange symbols that seemed to glow in the moonlight. "The markings," Delia whispered, "they're the same as on the trees." The pack leader stepped closer. He was massive, bigger than any bear I'd ever seen, with dark gray fur and eyes that glowed red. Behind him, the other dogmen formed a circle around us. Trapper was still fighting some of them, but he was getting weaker. That's when something strange happened. The knife in Delia's hand started humming. The sound made all the dogmen stop and cover their ears. Even the pack leader stepped back. "It's not just a weapon," Delia said, her voice getting stronger. "It's a key. These symbols, they're about breaking the curse." The pack leader roared and charged at us. I grabbed the knife from Delia and remembered my combat training. But nothing had prepared me for fighting a 9-foot-tall wolf monster. "The tree!" Trapper yelled, still wrestling with two dogmen. "Stab it into the tree!" I ran to the oak, dodging the pack leader's claws. They barely missed my head. I could feel his hot breath on my neck. With all my strength, I plunged the bone knife into the tree trunk. A bright light exploded from the symbols. The ground started shaking. All the dogmen, including Trapper, fell to their knees, howling in pain. The pack leader tried to reach me, but something was happening to him. His fur was falling out. He was shrinking. "No," he growled, his voice becoming more human. "We can't go back." Delia started reading the symbols on the tree. With each word, more dogmen began changing back to human form. They looked confused, scared, like people waking up from a long nightmare. But the victory came at a price. Trapper wasn't changing back like the others. Instead, he was fading away like smoke in the wind. "Thank you," he whispered, looking human one last time. 50 years. I'm finally free." When the sun rose, the clearing was full of confused people, the missing persons from all those posters. The pack leader had turned into an old military scientist, the one who'd first tried to control the dogmen back in the 70s. The government came, of course. They tried to cover everything up. But they couldn't hide all the evidence. My ruined camera still had some photos. And Delia had all her research. Sometimes at night, I still hear howling in the distance. But it's different now. Normal wolves, not those harmonized howls from that terrible night. The curse was broken, but the forest still holds its secrets. Delia and I, we still research strange things together, but we're more careful now. We know that some legends are better left alone, and some creatures should stay in the shadows where they belong. My name is Frank Martinez. Looking back at what happened that summer at Lake Tahoe still gives me chills. I never thought taking my 12-year-old son Joey on what was supposed to be a simple investigation would turn our lives upside down forever. After quitting my job as a casino security guard in Vegas, I started working as a private investigator. The pay wasn't great, but it let me spend more time with Joey since his mom passed away 3 years ago. When I got a call about investigating some strange disappearances at Lake Tahoe, I thought it would be a good chance to combine work with a father-son camping trip. We packed up our 1972 Winnebago RV, my pride and joy that I'd fixed up with some special security equipment. Joey was excited about the trip, but something felt off from the moment we arrived at Devil's Cove RV Park. The lake looked beautiful during the day, but at night, well, that's when things started getting weird. The first person we met was Grace Winters, a local researcher who seemed to know way too much about the lake's dark history. She had this worried look in her eyes when she saw Joey, like she knew something bad was going to happen. Then there was Deputy Bill Harrison, who kept showing up at odd times, asking too many questions about our investigation. Joey started having these strange dreams the very first night. He would wake up and draw these scary creatures, things that looked like humans but weren't quite right. When I asked him about the drawings, he just shrugged and said, "They're coming from the lake, Dad." I didn't know it then, but those drawings were just the beginning. We were about to uncover something that should have stayed hidden in the dark waters of Lake Tahoe. Something that would make me question everything I believed about the world and what lives in it. And it all started at 3:33 a.m., what people around here call the Devil's Hour. I remember that first night clearly. Joey and I were in our RV, and I was checking the surveillance screens I'd set up around Devil's Cove. The clock showed 3:30 a.m. when Joey suddenly sat up in his bed, his eyes wide open. "Dad," he whispered, "something's moving in the water." I tried telling him it was probably just the waves, but then our equipment started acting weird. The screens flickered, and the temperature inside the RV dropped so much I could see our breath. That's when we saw them, lights under the water, moving in patterns that no fish could make. The next morning, while Joey was drawing more of his creatures, I met Grace at the local diner. She spread out old newspapers on the table, showing me something that made my stomach turn. Every 30 years, people disappeared from Lake Tahoe. Not just one or two, but groups of them. The last time was in 1943, and now here we were in 1973. "There's more," Grace said, her hands shaking as she pulled out an old diary. "My grandmother wrote about them. They're not just stories, Frank. The things in the lake, they're real." Deputy Harrison kept showing up wherever we went, watching us. Once, I caught him standing near our RV at night, just staring at the lake. When he saw me, he smiled, but something about that smile wasn't right. Things got worse when Joey started knowing things he shouldn't. He'd wake up in the middle of the night, pointing at the lake, saying things like, "They're hungry," or "They're coming closer." I wanted to pack up and leave, but something told me we were already too deep into this. One evening, while checking the lake's edge with my flashlight, I found strange markings on the rocks. They looked ancient, carvings of creatures that were half human, half something else. Grace said they were water skinwalkers, beings that could change their shape. I didn't want to believe it, but after what I'd seen in the water, that's when we heard splashing sounds from the lake. Joey grabbed my arm and whispered, "Dad, they know we're here now." The worst part? Deputy Harrison was standing on the dock, smiling that wrong smile again, and he was holding something that looked very old and very wrong in his hands. That night changed everything. Deputy Harrison started walking towards us, still holding that strange object. It looked like an old stone tablet covered in weird symbols. My protective instincts kicked in, and I pushed Joey behind me. "You don't understand what you're dealing with, Martinez," Harrison said, his voice different now, deeper somehow. "The lake, it needs to feed. It's been 30 years. Before I could respond, something splashed in the water behind us. The sound wasn't like normal waves. It was like something big was moving under the surface. Joey gripped my jacket tighter. "Dad," he whispered, "they're coming out." Grace appeared out of nowhere, running towards us. "Get Joey back to the RV," she shouted. "Now!" We ran. Behind us, I heard more splashing, and what sounded like whispers in a language I'd never heard before. Inside the RV, I locked all the reinforced doors and turned on every light we had. Through the security cameras, we watched as dark shapes emerged from the water. They looked human-shaped, but moved all wrong, like their bones were in the wrong places. Grace was standing at the shore, holding up some kind of old necklace, speaking words that made my ears hurt. Joey suddenly grabbed his arm, crying out in pain. When I rolled up his sleeve, there was a mark there, like a handprint, but ice cold to the touch. He said it happened when something brushed against him while we were running. "They've chosen him," Grace said, her voice shaking. She had made it back to our RV and was now looking at Joey's mark. "Just like they chose my grandmother 30 years ago. Frank, there's something I need to tell you about my family, about why I'm really here." She pulled out an old photo from her pocket. It showed a group of people standing by the lake in 1943. In the front row was a young girl who looked exactly like Grace. "That's not my grandmother," she said quietly. "That's me." The mark on Joey's arm began to glow faintly blue, and outside, the lake started to bubble like a giant pot of boiling water. Grace's story came tumbling out as we huddled in the RV. The lake creatures had made a deal with her family long ago. They would grant long life in exchange for helping them find new victims every 30 years. She hadn't aged since 1943, trapped in this horrible cycle. "But I can't do it anymore," Grace said, tears in her eyes. "I can't help them take more people. That's why I've been trying to stop them this time." Joey's mark was getting brighter, and he was shivering, even though the RV was warm. Outside, Deputy Harrison was leading a group of people in dark robes towards the lake. The water was churning now, and those strange lights under the surface were getting brighter. "They're going to try to open the underwater temple," Grace explained. "It's where these creatures really live. And Joey's mark, they want to use him as a key." Suddenly, our RV rocked violently. Through the cameras, I saw wet handprints appearing on all the windows. They were surrounding us. "The panic room," I said, remembering the hidden space I'd built. "We need to—" But before I could finish, the RV's power went out. In the darkness, we heard something scratching at the roof. "Dad," Joey whispered, his mark now lighting up the whole room with an eerie blue glow. "I can hear them talking in my head. They're saying it's time." Grace grabbed her bag and pulled out some old papers covered in strange writing. "There's only one way to stop this," she said. "But it's dangerous, and we'll have to go to the temple ourselves." That's when we heard Deputy Harrison's voice outside, but it didn't sound human anymore. "Bring out the boy," he growled, "or we'll drag you all into the lake." I looked at my son, then at Grace. We had to make a choice: hide in the panic room and hope they wouldn't find us, or face whatever was out there in the dark water. We chose to fight. I couldn't let them take my son. Using the RV's panic room, we gathered everything we might need: flashlights, rope, and the old papers Grace brought. Joey was scared, but brave. He squeezed my hand and said, "I trust you, Dad." The creatures and cult members chased our RV as I drove along the dark mountain roads around Lake Tahoe. The wheels screeched against the wet pavement as those things kept trying to climb onto our vehicle. Their wet hands left glowing marks everywhere they touched. The temple entrance is hidden in a cave under the north side of the lake. Grace shouted over the noise of the engine. "We have to get there before they catch us." Through the rearview mirror, I saw Deputy Harrison's face change. His skin was turning scaly, and his eyes glowed like the creatures from the lake. He was transforming into one of them. Joey's mark was burning brighter now, and he said something that chilled me to the bone. "Dad, they're not chasing us. They're hurting us." He was right. No matter which way I turned, they forced us toward the north shore. When we finally stopped, we were exactly where they wanted us, at a hidden cove I'd never seen before. The water in front of us parted like a curtain, revealing stone steps leading down into the darkness. Joey's mark pulled him forward like a magnet. Grace held her old papers tight and started reading from them. "Once we go down," she said quietly, "there's no turning back. The only way to end this is to break the curse where it started, in the temple chamber." Behind us, we could hear Deputy Harrison and his cult getting closer. Their footsteps made weird, wet sounds on the ground. "Whatever happens," I told Joey, holding him close, "we stick together." As we took our first steps down into the underwater temple, the water closed behind us. We were trapped, but at least we were trapped together. The underwater temple was like nothing I'd ever seen. The walls glowed with a faint blue light, similar to Joey's mark. Our footsteps echoed as we walked down the ancient stone hallway, water dripping from somewhere above us. "The main chamber is ahead," Grace whispered. "That's where they perform their ritual every 30 years. Joey suddenly stopped walking. "They're coming," he said, his voice shaking. "Lots of them." We could hear them now, the splashing sounds of wet feet and that strange whisper language. Deputy Harrison's transformed voice echoed through the temple. "You can't stop what's meant to be." We ran into the main chamber, a huge round room with a pool in the center. Ancient carvings covered the walls, showing the same creatures Joey had been drawing. Grace quickly pulled out her papers and started reading the words out loud, her voice getting stronger with each line. That's when they surrounded us. The creatures emerged from every doorway, their bodies twisted and dripping, somewhere between human and fish. Deputy Harrison stood at the front, barely recognizable anymore. "The boy belongs to the lake now," he growled. Joey's mark was glowing brighter than ever, and the pool in the center began to bubble and swirl. A larger creature was rising from it, something ancient and terrible. Grace stepped forward, still reading. "There's only one way to end this," she said between words. "The pact must be broken by one who made it." She pulled out her grandmother's necklace, the same one from the old photo, and threw it into the pool. The water turned red, and Grace began to age rapidly before our eyes. "Run!" she screamed. "Get to the surface! The temple is collapsing!" The creatures shrieked as the walls started crumbling. Water was pouring in from everywhere. Joey and I ran as fast as we could, climbing over fallen stones as water rushed in around us. Behind us, we could hear the creatures screaming and Deputy Harrison's roar of anger. The whole temple was falling apart. "Dad, look," Joey pointed up. Through the falling rocks, we could see a crack of daylight. The temple's collapse was opening a way to the surface. We were almost there when I heard Grace's final words echo through the chamber. "The cycle ends today." Then came a bright flash and a sound like thunder from deep below. The mark on Joey's arm flared one last time, then faded away like an old scar. We swam up through the opening, pushing against the current until we finally broke through to the surface of Lake Tahoe. Our RV was still there when we dragged ourselves onto the shore. As we watched, the lake's surface bubbled and churned for a few minutes, then became completely still. The morning sun made it look peaceful, like nothing had ever happened. That was 2 years ago. Joey and I still live in our RV, but we never stayed near Lake Tahoe again. Sometimes, Joey draws pictures of Grace, not as the young woman we met, but as she might have looked if she'd been allowed to age normally. He says she visits him in his dreams sometimes, telling him she's at peace now. The lake has been quiet since that night. No more disappearances, no more strange lights under the water. Deputy Harrison and his cult members were never found, and the entrance to the underwater temple seems to have vanished completely. But every now and then, when I drive past a lake at night, I swear I can see faint lights moving under the water. And Joey, well, he still won't go swimming anywhere. Neither will I. Some things change you forever. Now, when people ask me what happened at Lake Tahoe that summer, I just tell them to stay away from the water at 3:33 a.m. Some doors are better left closed, some stories better left untold. But at least Joey and I made it out. And somewhere, I like to think Grace is finally resting after all those years of being trapped in time.